This episode of Stand Up and Holler is brought to you by Thrive Fantasy. Come prop up on Thrive Fantasy this football season. Thrive Fantasy is a daily fantasy sports and esports app for player props. With Thrive, you can eliminate the countless hours of research and focus on only the top tier athletes that have the biggest impact on the game. Choose 10 out of the 20 available player props to build your lineup. Each prop is assigned a fantasy value for both the over and the under based on how likely it is to hit. Hit the most props and rack up the most points to win a share of the prize pool. Use promo code REACT when you sign up today, and you'll receive a 100% instant first deposit match up to $100. Download Thrive Fantasy on the App Store or Play Store or by visiting their website, www.thrivefantasy.com. Sign up and prop today.
I'm Nick Knudsen, joined by Will Miles. Welcome to Stand Up and Holler. On this week's episode, we'll dissect that nightmare of a bowl game that we were forced to witness this past week. It's Miller time. Ventral returns. Welcome news on the defense. We'll go back for a second round of Miller time and discuss Jack Miller transferring in from Ohio State at the quarterback position. Will wrote an article about that this week on readandreaction.com. And we'll cap the show off with Billy Napier adding a few more position coaches. We'll break down our thoughts on 3 new position coaches announced this past week. Will, how's your Christmas with the family, man?
Not too bad. We just sort of stayed here in Pennsylvania, which is nice. It was nice to go home for Thanksgiving, go to South Florida, but it's also nice to not have to travel with 4 small kids. So I'm excited to bring everybody another stand up and holler. Excited to bring another bonus when we talk about the February signing day. If people go over to Patreon, sign up for that. You can check out the bonus where we talk about what to expect for the February signing day. But yeah, I mean, it's always sort of a fun time to reflect when you get to Christmas. And, now that Mullen's out, we got people slinging arrows at him for the way that he was running things while he was here. So certainly a lot to talk about. And, it's sort of the way it always is with Gator Nation. But, now more than usual, given the bowl game and the results and that sort of stuff.
Well, we definitely hope all of our listeners had a great Christmas and, hopefully have a good week here leading up to the new year. This will be the final show of the new year for Stand Up and Holler, but we'll jump into 2 bits here with the Gasparilla Bowl recap. Not a topic that a lot of us are dying to talk about, I suppose there, Will. But after the game, I was doing some soul searching how I wanted to discuss it. And I dug into the history of Gasparilla. So it's about a pirate named Jose Gasper who may be real, may be fictional. There's some disagreement over it. He went by Gasparilla and controlled much of the southwest Florida coast from the 1780s to 1821. Good run for a pirate there. Not too bad. The U.S. Navy disguised the USS Enterprise to look like a merchant ship in hopes of luring in Gasparilla's attack. Gasparilla took the bait, attacked, and by the time the naval ship revealed itself, it was too late, and Gasparilla's ship was overwhelmed. Instead of being captured, Gasparilla wrapped the chains of the anchor around his body, held his sword up high, and proclaimed, "Only I control my destiny," before throwing himself into the sea attached to the anchor. This story, Will, it very much feels like what we need to do with the 2021 season here. Look, we lost. We got beat. No excuses. I know we were down players. We got beat. UCF deserves its due for this one. But if someone outside of Gator Nation wanted to know what went wrong in 2021, they could have just tuned in for 60 minutes of this game because the Gators showed all of their warts throughout this one. One of your top defenders loses his cool. No discipline, ends up getting ejected from the game, right? Stubbornly sticking with the strategy that's not working. Let Emory Jones throw deep again. Greg Knox. That was really working throughout the game. And multiple special teams atrocities set the tone for an embarrassing night that UCF will dedicate to the ages. Unfortunately, Will, we're going to have to eat this turd sandwich and hope that Billy Napier can have this thing in shape by the time UCF comes into Gainesville in 2024. But this game was a good reminder of why changes need to be made within the program. That's all I could think about when I was watching it in frustrating fashion throughout the entire game on last Thursday night.
Yeah, I mean, it was a repeat to the show that we've seen all of 2021, right? I mean, the inconsistencies against Kentucky, even the inconsistencies against Alabama, inconsistencies against LSU, consistently bad against South Carolina, inconsistencies against Missouri, even inconsistencies against Samford. And all those inconsistencies all sort of hit at one time. The only thing it didn't hit was the turnovers, and that's the reason that the game was as close as it was. But the offense has struggled to get things going when Anthony Richardson hasn't been in there. Anthony Richardson was injured, couldn't play, and so we had the Emory Jones show, and the offense, lo and behold, was inconsistent and stalled and was stagnant, and they didn't get the ball to the running backs nearly enough. And when they did, the running backs were actually very good, but had a bunch of sort of 3rd and 2, 3rd and 1s that they couldn't convert. And, it's sort of been the story of the year. So, I mean, look, congratulations to Central Florida. I think at the end of the day, it's good for the state to have a team like that rise up and win. I think we all sort of suspect that won't be a permanent thing, but they're headed to the Big 12, and so they can get left out of the playoff just like they did in the AAC, because the Big 12 ain't going to make the playoff either with Texas and Oklahoma coming here. So look, it is what it is. I mean, at the end of the day, Florida lost. They should have won the game. They didn't. They dominated the first half, to be honest. We're only up 10-9, and that's where the game was lost. Is they had an opportunity. They had multiple opportunities actually to hit daggers down the field, like you mentioned, and Emory Jones wasn't able to hit it. And that's sort of been the story of the year. I mean, the Kentucky game, I know our buddy Gator Dave got into a little bit of a staring match with Mullen over the Zoom call when he asked Dan why Emory wasn't going deep. Well, I think we sort of saw why Emory wasn't going deep in that game against Kentucky. The reality is that there were multiple throws where guys were open by 3, 4, 5 yards, where even an underthrow gets you a 15-yard penalty at worst. And an underthrow gives you a jump ball for somebody like Justin Shorter, who's taller than everybody who's out there. They finally started doing it in the fourth quarter. Once they were behind, they threw a bunch of back shoulder throws to their receivers on the outside, were able to complete 2 or 3 to Copeland and Shorter. But by then they were so far behind that they just weren't able to punch it in, weren't able to sort of stop the bleeding, and ran too much clock as they were going up and down the field. So, yeah, I mean, look, it's frustrating. It feels like, it's funny. I watched Central Florida play LSU a few years ago in Joe Burrow's pre-Heisman year. And watching that LSU team, because I was rooting for LSU just because I didn't want back-to-back fake national championships. And watching that game, I was so frustrated watching LSU with all of the mistakes and just shooting themselves in the foot. They were a far superior team and then weren't able to put that game away until the end. That's what this one felt like, except Florida didn't get the win in this one. And part of that is because Joe Burrow is better than Emory Jones. Part of that is because LSU was more talented than this Florida team. But part of it is just, the reality is that at some point you have to make plays. And, every time there was an opportunity to make a play, there was a roughing the passer, or there was an unsportsmanlike conduct, or there was a missed field goal, or there was, or even the onside kick where I don't even think they meant to do it, but they kick it right into the guy. They got 9 guys just like surrounding the ball, and somehow Central Florida comes away with the ball. Hey, it is what it is.
Followed by 2 15-yard penalties that helped them get a field goal on that.
I mean, look, right? It was ugly. The whole season's been ugly. I don't know why this surprises us, though it surprised me because I picked Florida to win yet again. I apparently won't learn my lesson this year, and it's a good thing that I'm not gambling on Florida, because if I was, I'd be down some money this year. Well, unless I took the money line, then I'd probably be okay. But the reality is that the Florida team just isn't that good this year. And that is the thing that all those guys are going to have to go do some soul searching about. And, when it comes down to whether they buy into Napier or not, I hope that a lot of them look at it and say, God, I don't want to go 6-7. 6-7 sucks. And, at the end of the day, even if it's 9-3, it's better than 6-7. And it's worth the time and effort. And why am I getting up at 5 a.m. to run stairs and gassers and all this sort of stuff again? Just to go 6-7? No, I'm going to actually start paying attention to detail. And so, clearly there are some discipline issues within the program that need to be taken care of. I think Strickland even alluded to that when he sort of, said that the losing was a symptom, not the actual disease. And that was the underlying reason to dismiss Mullen when he did after South Carolina, or after Missouri. And so, hopefully that's one of the things that Billy Napier could take care of. But yeah, man, it was ugly.
Ugly's the word. Ugly, miserable. I'm not the type. I don't think we should be the type of fan base that makes any excuses for this too. I mean, losing the UCF, we should just look at that as never acceptable. Period. And if we are where we're supposed to be as a program in 2024, it's going to be a completely different ballgame in Gainesville. So I'm very much all of a sudden looking forward to that. But until then, we're just going to have to keep our mouths shut, let your UCF fans run their mouths, and then their day's coming. Their day's
Good
coming.
for them.
So
good for them. You know what?
it is. It's the Hall of Fame day for them, though, and you are going to hear about it. So I'm saying, don't bother the excuses that we're missing this guy, we're missing that. None of that stuff's going to matter to them. None of that's going to matter. They beat the guys in Florida Gator jerseys on that field, and they're going to have that for another year and a half here.
Win the SEC, go to the playoff, and then let them win the Big 12 and get left out. And that's basically the best payback you can have. So I don't care about 2024. Win the SEC, make the playoff, and little brother can say whatever he wants.
Well, and to your point there, Will, you got the playoff coming up this week. One of the programs in that playoff is Michigan. Michigan, who's had a terrible stretch the last couple of years here, rumors of Jim Harbaugh being out of a job. That's the type of program that could turn it around within a season or two and be in that position to contend for a playoff spot. But I'm going to point to that. I think you referenced the Matt Hayes article here in Saturday Down South, cited major criticisms from internal people under Dan Mullen with regards to the approach to recruiting. One former Florida staffer told Hayes, quote, "We recruited with no home base, no foundation of what we were looking for. The prevailing idea from the top was we're not begging players to come here." And then another quote in the article that stood out to me was, you know how many times I heard we'll address that in the portal. Another former Florida staffer told me, "You're the flagship university in the best state for recruiting in the country. You don't need the portal for anything." Two statements, Will, that stand out from Matt Hayes' article in Saturday Down South about the state of the Florida program under Dan Mullen. These are also 2 points you've been hitting on for a couple of years now.
4 years, really. Yeah, I mean, look, we all know.
Let's try to be nice to Dan.
Well, it's funny because when Hayes further on goes in the article, and there's some stuff I agree with that rings true. And Hayes has been one of those guys who's been consistently critical of Mullen this year, even before Mullen was gone. And that is a little bit refreshing because oftentimes you see somebody gets dismissed and then they get kicked on their way out the door. Hayes was getting quotes from people inside the program before Mullen was dismissed, which tells you something about the dysfunction within the program. But the thing that really sort of tipped everybody off who pays attention to this stuff, that recruiting wasn't going to be good enough, is that 2019 second recruiting class, that bump class, where, you know, you've got Chris Steele as the top ranked guy. He ends up not playing. You got Jalen Jones, who's the quarterback, who gets dismissed as well. Kyer Elam is really the only guy who's panned out truly from that class. You've got guys like Hopper, who looks like he might be good, but hasn't gotten a whole lot of run until this year. You got Diabate, who obviously is transferring out, but has played valuable minutes. You've got Aguaquin and Ethan White on the offensive line, neither one of who has been a true standout, but have certainly played minutes. And then you've got Whittemore, who's been decent at wide receiver, but hasn't been able to stay healthy. Beyond that, there isn't anybody in that class who really, there's 0 all SEC players. You've got probably 5 starters, but you don't have anybody who's really an impact. 8 guys never contributed or transferred. If you look at the Michigan class from 2019, that's interesting. They've got 3 all Big Ten players, 7 starters from that class, and only 5 guys who never contributed or transferred. And that includes the 3 guys where you've got DeJuan Black, Diaby Hammond, and Wardrick Wilson. Hammond and Wilson never set foot on campus. Black had to go elsewhere and now has made his way back. But so at the end of the day, those are just very different classes in terms of the way that they've worked out. And the reality is that the guys who have transferred from Michigan have transferred and have had success elsewhere. The reason they transferred is because there were other guys on the roster who've gotten all Big Ten selections in front of them. So a guy like Zach Charbonnet, who went to UCLA and was very, very good this year, he ends up leaving because guys like Hassan Haskins and Blake Corum, both running backs, both end up on the all Big Ten team. So he was behind guys in the 18 class and the 20 class, comes in 19 for Charbonnet and decides to transfer out because he's behind people. That's what you want, right? You want the guys who transfer out, you want them to transfer out because they're behind somebody better. You don't want a guy like Chester Kimbrough transferring out and then being an excellent player for Michigan State when you're sitting there going, wow, we could really use a corner this year. and we just haven't had that, right? You get a guy like DeJuan Black who finally makes his way to campus this year, and it's a great story him getting here. But we really needed some linebackers this year. You've got guys like Tyron Hopper who don't play all that much, and to be honest, is that a Hopper problem or is that a coach problem? I don't know. But Hopper doesn't play very much, and we could really use linebackers, especially we're going to talk about Ventral Miller in a minute. So the reality is that 19 class is the thing that I look at and go, there just hasn't been a whole lot of contributions to there. In fact, if you look at the 2020 class, there actually have been quite a few contributions from that team. If you can't count Anthony Richardson as a starter, there's 7 starters from that class. You've got Trevez Johnson, Jeremy Crawshaw, Rashad Torrance, Josh Braun, AR, you got Xavier Henderson and Gervon Dexter. Those are all guys who started at various times throughout the last year or two. That's a lot of contributions to that 2020 class. You got Jason Marshall from the 2021 class, but you don't really expect a whole lot from the brand new class coming in, especially when they're not 5-star guys. So they got contributions from their 5-star guy. I actually think the 2020 and 2021 classes have contributed quite a bit. The problem is you didn't have any depth backing it up in the 2019 class. And if you look at any teams that have made the playoffs this year, especially, so I went back and looked at the 2021, 2020, and 2019 playoffs. And the only team that didn't get the bulk of its all SEC players from 3 years prior. So this year's 2021 playoff, that means 2018. So Cincinnati, 5 of its 12, Michigan, 5 of its 15. Alabama only has 1 of its 10, but then 5 of its 10 from the 2019 class. They're a little bit young this year, but Georgia, 5 of its 11 all SEC players are 2018. Last year, if you look at the 2020 playoff, Alabama, 6 of 13 in 2017, Ohio State, 8 of 17, Clemson, 4 of 12, Notre Dame, 4 of 12, because Notre Dame was in the SEC or the ACC last year. So they were able to have all conference guys last year, whereas they wouldn't have before. So LSU, 3 of 15. They actually are, again, one of those outliers where they had 6 from the 2017 class, but they got an all-world season from Joe Burrow. Then you got Clemson, 6 in 2016, 6 of their 16. Then you got 4 of 18 for Ohio State, and then 2 of 11 for Oklahoma. So what it really boils down to is you look at it, that 2018 class is the one that you'd be looking for this year with supplementation from the 2019 class. And those are the 2 classes that Florida just hasn't gotten anything out of. The 2020 and 2021 classes, I mean, Alabama has 2 guys on the all SEC team from the 2020 class. Is that valuable? Absolutely. But that's not the reason that they made the playoff this year. You look at Georgia, they got 1 guy from the 2020 class, 1 guy from the 2021 class of their 11. Is that great? Has that helped them? Absolutely. But it's the 7 guys from the 18 and the 19 class who are the critical components to why they've made the playoff this year. So if you want to look at Florida's prospects moving forward, next year, the classes that are going to be important are going to be that 19 class and the 20 class. That's going to be where you look for the maximum number of guys who are giving you those contributions. And I think Florida's going to struggle because that 19 class hasn't been much of a contributor. But then you get to that next year where you've got 2020 and 2021 are the ones that are important. And that's, I think, where Napier's going to have to make his move, supplementing from this class and then his bump class in 2023 to make the team elite. And you can see that if you look back at, when Saban took over at Alabama, when Urban Meyer took over at Florida, when, even when Kirby took over at Georgia, the bump class is just supplementary. It's just a supplementary feature to the guys who are, to the guys who are already there. And it's interesting if you look at what Saban did when he was at Alabama. So 2007, 2008, and 2009, he had 26 all SEC players. 17 of those guys were people who were recruited by Mike Shula. So only 9 players were people that were recruited by him who actually then were major contributors on those 17 or on the 2007, 2008, and 2009 teams. Obviously, the 2008 team makes it to the SEC championship game. The 2009 team wins the national championship. So it's not as though guys like Mark Ingram and Julio Jones weren't important, but so were guys like Mike Johnson, Colin Peake, Javier Arenas, Lee Tiffin, who else? Andre Smith, Antoine Caldwell, Simone Castile, like all those guys were guys who were there before Saban took over, and he was able to mold them into players who were significant contributors for Alabama. So, I think the sky is falling aspects of those 2020, 2021 classes, the thing I sort of take umbrage with what Hayes wrote. But from an overall perspective, not having a recruiting identity, not recruiting well enough, not having the apparatus in place and to bring in elite talent, relying on the transfer portal. Yeah, I'm on board with that. That was suboptimal.
Now, when they take the shot, when the staffer takes a shot at not having a recruiting identity, can you define that more broadly? Will, is he talking about they're not strong in a particular region of the state, that they don't focus on certain positions enough? What do you think he meant by that?
I mean, I think he means exactly what Bill Sykes said back in 2018, which is, he called it chasing pyrite when they were going after Chris Steele in California. And he outlined all the guys in California that Florida's gone after and what's happened. And even the guys they brought in didn't work out. And one of the reasons that they didn't bring out is a bunch of them transferred back. And that's exactly what happened with Steele. It happened a little bit earlier with Steele, and there was the stuff with Jalen Jones that was kind of fishy and, decided to leave. And obviously the assault charges aren't fishy for Jones. Those are things obviously you deal with. But the response to those assault charges for Chris Steele, I think, was the thing that sort of pushed him out, or at least the reasoning that he used to transfer back home. But if he's from Lakeland, he's not transferring to Southern Cal, after the first spring or fall camp. Like, he's going to Miami or Florida State or something like that. Like, the chances of getting poached are probably much, much less. That, I think, is the thing about a recruiting identity. Like, who do you want to be? Where are you going to go? How are you going to build relationships with the high school coaches? The first thing Billy Napier did that I think everybody was very impressed with is he said, we need guys from IMG. And if nothing else, we need guys from IMG because we need to have the perception that we can get a guy from anywhere in the country. When, in our backyard, that's where the talent is accumulated. Our identity is going to be, we'll walk into anywhere. We're going to build relationships, and we're going to bring people in from IMG. And he brings in Kamari Wilson. So Wilson being a 5-star recruit, being a safety, all that sort of stuff is important. But I think the most important aspect of that recruitment and that commitment is that he went into IMG and he got something done that none of the Florida coaches have gotten done before. And so from an identity perspective, it's not only are we going to go have these conversations, but we're going to actually get the job done. And if they can open up a pipeline to IMG, it's not going to matter whether they bring in guys from California, right? What's going to matter is that the guys like Kamari Wilson who come to Florida are going to go back to IMG, and they're going to tell their teammates, you should either come here or you shouldn't, right? And so if all the stuff that Napier was selling to Wilson was true, and Wilson loves it and he loves the relationships and Napier's genuine and all that sort of stuff, it should open up a real pipeline to Florida. And I think that's the thing that should happen at all the high schools around Florida, right? You get that first guy in, you convince him to come, and all of a sudden he goes back home and starts talking to his teammates. When's the last time you saw multiple guys come from one school all come to Florida sort of year after year after year after year? We thought that might happen with Lakeland back when Keon Zipper committed and some of the other guys there. I think Hammond was from Lakeland as well. But the last time I remember it happening was with the Pouncies, right? With Chris Rainey and some of those guys come. Yeah, all those guys coming from Lakeland. And not only did those guys want to play with each other, but I guarantee you the guys who came to campus then went back to that high school. And if you've got a relationship with the high school coach, if the high school coach trusts you, if the players come back and say they love playing for you, like, then it becomes a place you want to be. And that identity was never built at Florida. Whether that's because Dan Mullen wasn't good at setting up the relationships with the high school coaches, or whether it's because he wasn't setting up a relationship with his players to where they were evangelistic when they went back home, I don't necessarily know. But what I do know is that we have not seen a circle around Gainesville of some mileage where Kirby's not allowed in, where, Taggart and Norvell aren't allowed in, where now Cristobal's not allowed in. That circle is the identity. And Kirby Smart's done a good job of that. You don't come into Georgia, maybe South Georgia, but you don't come into that Georgia, South Carolina area and get too many of the blue chip guys that Kirby Smart wants. Same thing in Tuscaloosa. For the most part, if you're in Alabama and you're a high level guy and there's not somebody else higher level in your way, you're going to Alabama. And then that's the identity. The identity is being the flagship university in the state, not just saying you're the flagship university and then getting your lunch eaten by Clemson, Georgia, Alabama, Florida State, and Miami.
I'll add a caveat to your Kirby statement and say, unless you're a quarterback, Trevor Lawrence, Justin Fields, Deshaun Watson. But okay.
Hey, Justin Fields went there. He just didn't like it and left because they started Jake Fromm instead.
He did leave. The part of the statement I absolutely disagree with is saying you don't need the portal for anything. Now, within the context of the statement, I think there's just that's maybe a bit of an exaggeratory statement there, saying you don't need the portal for anything. You look at some of the top programs in the nation here. I mean, Alabama, once again, setting the standard for go after those top high school recruits. But a guy like Jamison Williams this year, they already got a commitment from running back Jamar Gibbs coming over from Georgia Tech. Great running back. He's going to be a solid weapon for them next year. So when you get to the point where the portal is just a tool for you to hand pick top tier talent that fits your roster well, that's how we want to be using the portal. So the portal will always have some kind of use, but the way we've been using it the last few years is out of desperation and need. And then you end up taking guys who you're not totally necessarily excited about, or guys that maybe they might fit in theory, but maybe they're not the exact guys you want. And that's what seems to have happened the last couple of years.
Yeah, I mean, so I think saying that you don't use the portal is very similar to saying, well, you don't need to use NIL, right? Name, image, and likeness is for schools that aren't like Florida or aren't like Alabama or whatever, or, they should just want to come here. And that's the thing that I think is being reflected in that statement is, we'll find a different way to fill it. We don't have to work as hard. If that first kid doesn't want to come here, we'll go on to kid 2 and kid 3. Well, it turns out kid 1 and 2 are going to be all SEC players. Kid 3 and 4 are going to be, solid depth players. And there's a difference between those guys when you have them out there, and you need to woo them. And the same thing with the portal, and the same thing with NIL, like all those things put together. It's funny. I'm reading a book right now and basically putting small habits together to make larger habits, or to make larger overall differences in your life. And that's one of the things that I think is important in recruiting too, is you can't give up an edge anywhere, right? Like you shouldn't, like if you've got a minute and a half left and at the end of the half and you're up by 14, you should be up by 21, or 17, go get the points, because you don't know what's going to happen in the second half. You don't know who's going to be injured. If you have an opportunity to call timeouts at the end of the second half, when, it'll take a miracle, we'll need an onside kick, all that sort of stuff, you still do it. If you have an opportunity to game plan where you get a wide receiver or where you get a running back on a linebacker, and you can just drill that over and over and over again, do it. And then you do it against Georgia in 2020 and just hit the wheel route over and over and over again. The reality is that it's not acceptable at a school like Florida to be 5th in the SEC in recruiting year after year after year after year. And the idea that we're supposed to accept that you should be 5th in recruiting year after year after year after year because you win every once in a while on the field against some of these elite teams, to me seems short-sighted. It's one of those things where you're already handicapping yourself before you even get on the field. So if you say we don't need the transfer portal, well, that's also short-sighted, right? Because you might be able to find an edge in the transfer portal. I'm thrilled DeMarcus Bowman is Gator. Now you got to use DeMarcus Bowman, and that's one of the things that hopefully we'll see in the next year or two. But the reality is that if you've got the ability to get somebody who's homesick and is going to have 3 or 4 years of eligibility left, that's awesome. Like that's worth using it. Now, if you're bringing in guys who are 3-star recruits who are losing on the depth chart at Auburn, then, hey, like those guys are valuable pieces. Like I don't want to talk down guys like Antonio Valentino or Daquan Newkirk. Like they're Gators, they played hard, but those aren't difference makers. And the question is always, if you're bringing in a guy to plug a hole, or you're putting a Band-Aid on a bullet hole, that doesn't do any good. At some point, you got to have the surgery and put that up. Like the Band-Aid can be okay for a little bit, but eventually you got to sew that thing up. Otherwise it gets infected and rots and, the patient dies. And I think that's kind of what we've seen over the last few years, is that Florida was able to stem the bleeding with otherworldly performances by Kadarius Toney, Kyle Pitts, and even Kyle Trask. And the bleeding finally, the dam finally broke. The bleeding really came out when guys like Newkirk and Valentino and Truesdell and Shorter and some of the other guys that they've got in the transfer portal just weren't able to produce at that elite level. But a guy like John Grenard, get him every time, right? The issue is if you're reliant on John Grenard being transcendent in order to make your defense go, well, that's a problem. If him adding 12 sacks means your defense is nasty, okay, well, then that's a really valuable thing to have. So you look at a team like Alabama, where they bring in To'o to play middle linebacker this year. If To'o hadn't come, Alabama would have been okay. But having To'o makes them a better team. And I think that's sort of the same thing, right? Like if Gibbs doesn't commit to Alabama, they're still a good team next year. They still have guys in the running back stable. In fact, they got Trey Sanders there, who I wish was a Gator as well. But Gibbs is going to make them a better team. And so you do everything you can to gain every little edge. And when you have the opportunity, take the edge and go for it.
All right. Well, that was an extra long 2 bits tonight. So let's slide over to 4 bits, Will. And we'll talk about Ventral Miller coming back, the leading tackler from 2020, missed a lot of time this season. He was out after the USF game he had surgery to repair a torn biceps tendon. He announced it this week. He said, "Life is full of tough decisions. However, my mind is made up. I'm excited to announce that I will be entering the New Year's as a Florida Gator. Merry Christmas, hashtag last ride, hashtag go Gators." This is welcome news for a roster that is very shallow at the linebacker position at the moment. You have some good young players. We saw one of them really play well in that bowl game before the unfortunate incident where he was ejected, but Tyron Hopper was on pace to have himself a day in that game. He had 4 tackles, 3 solo, 1 sack, and 1.5 tackles for loss. He was all over the field. So you got Tyron Hopper, a young guy like Derek Wingo coming back, Ventral Miller coming back. All of a sudden, that position looks a little more stable heading into 2021, where you'll be able to mix some of that experience with a little bit of youth.
Yeah, I mean, Miller's a great addition. I mean, I think at the end of the day, obviously him going down before the Alabama game, you don't know how much he was contributing before that. We saw Florida back in, I think it was 2018, really struggled when David Reese was out. And then when Reese came back, all of a sudden the defense was much, much better. Maybe that was 19. I can't remember which year Reese was out, but one of those years he was out and the defense struggled. And then when he came back, everything really got better. I think one of the problems, though, is still that if Ventral Miller is going to solve your defensive problems, then Florida's got some issues, because he was there in 2019 or in 2020, and the defense was pretty putrid. And in fact, Najee Harris was able to isolate him a little bit there in coverage in that SEC championship game. Yeah, well, I'm being kind. So there are some holes in his game, I suppose, is maybe the way to say it. Now, I think that one of the things that you can do is you can put him in a situation to succeed. Like, there were multiple times in that game where I thought that they could have done something where they had Diabate shift to take Najee Harris in coverage and leave Ventral Miller on the inside in that SEC championship game. They chose not to. And then Najee Harris was able to beat Miller to the outside. Now, Harris is a special player, right? I mean, Harris is an excellent player. And if you're playing against Brian Robinson this year for Alabama, maybe it's a different story. But, I'm happy he's back. But I think if we're relying on Ventral Miller to shore up the linebacker position on defense, I think that's probably short-sighted. Now, one thing I will say is that you've got some pretty highly recruited guys there. You got Shamar James coming in this year, already signed, obviously, from the 2022 class. You don't really want to expect a lot from guys in the 2022 class, but when you get top 100 guys, you expect them to at least contribute. You've got Chief Borders, who was ranked 309th overall, Scooby Williams, who was ranked 74th overall in the 2021 class. And then you already mentioned Tyron Hopper and Derek Wingo there from the who are eligible to be out in 2023, but then you've got DeJuan Black as well. And then you got David Reese, who's been really injured, ranked 297th overall, but he was one of the earlier commits on at the linebacker position. So you've got some depth there. You've got some players there. I think Miller obviously shores it up. And from a leadership perspective, you figure Miller's not coming. So Ventral Miller would have had an opportunity to transfer someplace else and play. He could have gone in the transfer portal and found a place where he didn't have to buy into Billy Napier. So to me, this suggests that a leader on the team has bought into the idea that Florida's a special place, that Napier's the guy who's going to turn it around, and that he's going to be part of that turnaround, at least in year one. So that, I think, is a recruiting win for Napier in some respects. But, I like Ventral Miller, but I don't know that he's we're not getting Dylan Moses here at middle linebacker, right?
No,
this is a solid middle linebacker who's going to provide significant leadership.
He's going to be a mid to late round draft pick at best in 2023 when he's finally done with his career at Florida here. But what you get is a guy who's you get that super senior back for another year in a room with a lot of young linebackers who are unproven. Like you said, the DeJuan Blacks, Derek Wingos, Scooby Williams, a lot of talent on paper, not necessarily proven on the field at the University of Florida, though. So a guy who gets to set the tone of how to work under a new administration, everything else. I think that the leadership aspect is invaluable coming back. I think it's a great addition to this 2022 Gators roster. And I quite frankly, I wasn't expecting. I was expecting him to either declare or maybe hit the portal and get an opportunity where he'd be a clear-cut guy. I do think he will be a clear-cut guy to start this year at Florida, though. But, I mean, like you said, this is a guy who we've seen him struggle in coverage at times, pretty good against the run, struggles in coverage at times. And Hey, look, he was a big part of that 2020 defense, even though he was he was the leading tackler and looked really good at times. He was also part of those struggles too. So he definitely had a lot of questions to answer this year. It's unfortunate we only got to see him for about a game and a half there, but I don't think the addition doesn't make you worse for 2022. I'll put it that way.
No, and I think I'm still not entirely clear. This year, the super seniors didn't count against your scholarship count. Whether they count against your scholarship count next year or not, I don't necessarily know. I'm suspecting they probably won't. And so what that really means is that you essentially have a free spot for somebody who's in a leadership position, and that's valuable so long as they're not taking time away from somebody else who'd be in that position. I'm actually curious to see what's going to happen. Kamori Gamble's sort of in the same situation, I think, where he played all year. He certainly was a lot better this year, but he still has that year where he could come back as a super senior. Would he do that? And is that something that Napier would want? He's been more the blocking guy until this year when it's come to being that tight end. And so is that something that Napier wants? And when somebody like Gamble come back again, I sort of look at it and say, hey, not a transcendent player, not somebody that we're going to like bounce our grandkids on our knee and talk about Ventral Miller or Kamori Gamble. But I'd say the same thing about Felipe Franks, right? Felipe Franks was a big part of buying into Dan Mullen there in 2018 and getting the program turned in the right direction there in 18 and 19. And even though Franks isn't the guy you're going to look at, and if everything had worked out, you wouldn't have looked at Franks and been like, oh yeah, he's the reason that this happened. You would have looked at it and said, look, his buy-in was important from the start. Having a guy who had taken the bullets, under the McElwain era and then being able to make that transition is important. I think that's what guys like Miller and Gamble bring to the table. If Gamble comes back, but now that Miller is coming back.
Well, for 6 bits, we'll push over into 6 bits here and talk about the addition of Jack Miller to the Florida roster. You wrote an article breaking down Jack Miller's statistics, and you wanted to know, is he the next Joe Burrow? Obviously, the Ohio State transfer quarterback's going to make you ask that question. You love Joe Burrow's stats coming out was based on his high school career and what you projected him to be at his next stop, which ended up being LSU. And so you wanted to take that same look here at Jack Miller. A little background on Miller. 4-star recruit on 24/7 composite out of Scottsdale, Arizona. He was number 13 ranked quarterback in the country, number 9 ranked player in the state of Arizona in the 2020 recruiting class. He made one appearance for Ohio State in 2020, rushing 2 times for 23 yards and 1 TD in a blowout win against Nebraska. He's not super fast, but sneaky speed, I would say. He's big duty, 6'4", so when he runs, he covers a lot of ground. Definitely not Kyle Trask speed, Will, but he can cover a little more ground than your average guy. So he doesn't look ultra fast, but does cover a lot of ground when he runs. Appeared 4 times this past season in limited mop-up duty behind C.J. Stroud and Kyle McCord in Columbus, 2 5-star prospects. Tough quarterback room there. I did see a tweet that I forget who tweeted it out, but they said, hey, Gator fans, good talking point for you is that Jack Miller did manage to keep that 3rd spot ahead of Quinn Ewers, of course, the all-world transfer quarterback who was set to be the number 1 quarterback of the 2022 class, went to Ohio State a year early, transferred to Texas. But Miller was really derailed in November. He ended up pleading guilty to a reduced charge on reckless operation of a vehicle. A little bit too much to drink one night, sounds like, got behind a wheel. Was suspended from the team for a bit, was reinstated, and then ultimately transferred. So at one time, Will, he's top 100 prospect. However, his prospect status dipped a little bit. He did have some injuries in high school. It caused him to miss Elite 11 camp. It caused him to miss, I think he missed 5 games his senior year of high school. So I'm pointing that out because even though I'm going back a few years on that, a big reason you're bringing him in, one, Anthony Richardson has not proven he can stay healthy over the course of the season, and that's the presumed starter going into 2022 here. And you're basically bringing in a guy who's got the same questions of whether or not he can last for an entire season. So we at least got 2 guys that seem to be serviceable now in that locker room. And that's not to say anything about Del Rio or Kitna, because we don't know a ton about them. We haven't seen them in game time action. But with Miller coming in, it seems to give a little peace of mind to Gator Nation here that you'll have a quarterback who's ready to play in 2022 should Anthony Richardson dance a little too much on TikTok one night.
So, I mean, with Emory Jones leaving, it made sense that they were going to have to add a quarterback and add a quarterback who was ready to play, or at least had spent a couple of years in a system, a college system where he'd been watching film and had been working in the film room, right? I mean, that's one of the things you needed. Just bringing in a freshman wasn't necessarily going to make the difference. And this I think is more of a referendum on what Napier thinks about Carlos Del Rio Wilson and Jalen Kitna, probably than it is what he thinks about Anthony Richardson. I think anybody who watched Anthony Richardson last year saw the same things that Dan Mullen talked about, right? I mean, the reason Mullen didn't start Anthony Richardson is because Anthony Richardson wasn't really ready to start based on his knowledge of the offense. The problem is that if you were already getting interceptions from Emory Jones, then getting interceptions from Anthony Richardson didn't make much of a difference. Now, every time Anthony Richardson came out there, he seemed to get hurt, right? I mean, he got hurt in the game on the long run against what was it, FAU, and then USF, and then he got injured. He injured his hand against LSU, and then he has the concussion against Georgia, and obviously the dancing thing that injured his knee, and then the surgery after the FSU game. So obviously a lot of concerns there. But I think the thing I was trying to ask, and it was in a little bit of a hyperbolic way, because I don't think it's fair to call anybody Joe Burrow, but the question is do his stats in high school, do his stats in college, do I think they'll translate into somebody who's a good quarterback? And I think the people that you really need to compare him with when you look at his high school stats, so senior year, through 193 passes, averaged 8.4 yards per attempt, 59% completion percentage, 15 touchdowns, 4 interceptions. His best year was actually his true freshman year in high school, where he threw 338 passes, averaged 10.8 yards per attempt, 59% completion percentage, 53 touchdowns, and 15 interceptions. So he was really winging it there that freshman season. You look at Burrow, though, it's not even close. I mean, Burrow completed 72% of his passes, 12.8 yards per attempt, 63 touchdowns, and 2 interceptions his senior year. And he basically had almost the exact same stat line as junior year of high school as well. And he never dipped below 62% completion percentage the entire time, starting as a sophomore, junior, and a senior. So total 157 touchdowns, 17 interceptions, 12 yards per attempt, and 69% completion. You look at total for Miller, 57% completion, 9.6 yards per attempt, 115 touchdowns, and 31 interceptions. So he's definitely a step below. And in fact, I think when you start looking at guys similar to Miller, the guys you're really sort of looking at are guys like Malik Zaire, guys like Luke Del Rio,
Don't say that.
Guys like Jeff Driscoll, who, even though he's a 5-star recruit, only completed 59% of his throws in high school. And then even with a really good year at Louisiana Tech, only completed 61% of his throws in college. Maybe you compare him to DeAndre Francois, who completed 56% of his throws in high school and 59% in college, right? So these guys all had success in college, some to larger degrees than others. I mean, Driscoll, obviously, with a very good defense, was able to lead Florida on the brink of getting the BCS championship game. But they aren't guys that you would look at and say, oh, yeah, that's Tua, or that's Mac Jones, or that's going to be a guy who's going to win the Heisman. And that's what you're getting in Miller, right? You're getting a guy who's going to come and compete. You're getting a guy who's going to make sure that everyone else in the quarterback room knows what they're doing, hopefully, when it comes to being able to look at the film and spending time in the film room and competing. But I don't think you're finding this isn't Kyle Trask coming in. Trask had very limited film, but in the limited film that he had in high school, he was completing like 75% of his passes. And then when you saw him get in the game against Kentucky, it was like, okay, everybody's throwing to his wide open. The things that we've seen in very limited action are translating very quickly. Miller completed 56% of his passes in high school. He's completed 50% of his passes at Ohio State, granted in mop-up time, but still. Mop-up time should be one of those things where there's not a whole lot of pressure. You go through your progressions, you find guys who are open, and you deliver the ball. Only 14 throws, I think, total at Ohio State, but still, I mean, you would expect him to be 10 of 14 in mop-up time, not 7 of 14. I know that's only 3 completions, but it's one of those things where you look at where someone is today and where they are, what do their stats say they should get? And then if their stats reflect that, okay, like that makes sense. And I even looked at the film in the article, and you could see some things where he had opportunities based on the coverages. These are just like spring game highlights, but based on the coverage that was being played, he had opportunities to take some shots, and he just didn't do it. And in fact, got himself into some rough situations because he didn't, where he was completing the ball, but he was completing passes in tough situations rather than easy ones. And you saw the exact opposite when you looked at either Kyle Trask or Joe Burrow. You said these guys are completing it. They're reading the defense correctly and getting it to the correct receiver. So Again, I think it's going to be good competition for Florida, but anyone expecting Miller to come in and lead Florida to the promised land at quarterback, I think those expectations are unfair for Miller. And I think we know that coming in. So let's not be mean to him if he comes in and throws a few picks and only completes 55% of his balls. Like, that's kind of what we should expect based on what he's put on film and what he's put on the stat sheet thus far.
Gives the quarterback room some depth, allows for Anthony Richardson. We love what we've seen out of him so far, obviously, in the limited amount of time we've been able to see him, but there's been that concern to stay on the field. So this definitely gives you that immediate backup plan. But Jack Miller, probably not going to be a significant long-time starter for the Gators. Although I do, if you had to bet money, how many games over under Jack Miller starts in 2022?
3, probably.
Yeah, I was going to say 2.5 would be the over-under. I definitely expect him to get a couple starts next year, whether by injury or for some other reason. So this is a key pickup for the Gators and Billy Napier for the early years of the Billy Napier era at Florida. Speaking of Napier here, Will, let's move on to a dollar. And Napier has been busy filling out the remainder of his staff. Not fully there yet. Just loving the way they're announcing this, just a steady roll of every different position that you can imagine under the sun being announced about every 2 to 3 days on social media. But you see Darnell Stapleton, the offensive line coach, coming over from Louisiana to fill the same position at Florida. He was a finalist for the Remington Trophy as a senior at Rutgers in 2007. Stapleton was a member of the Pittsburgh Steelers from 2007 to 2010. 2007 to 2010, and was on the squad that won Super Bowl 43. He started 18 games at offensive line during his time in Pittsburgh, including the Super Bowl. 2016, he coached Julian Davenport, who captured the first team All-American honors and Associated from the Associated Press, American Football Coaches Association, Walter Camp Football, and STATS. Also, 4-time All-Patriot League selection, Davenport became Bucknell's first NFL draft pick since 1969 when he was taken in the 4th round by the Houston Texans. So Bucknell University, not a school that produces a lot of offensive linemen. Stapleton goes in there and produces a draft pick for the Houston Texans. 4 seasons at Sam Houston State. We saw Sam Houston State last spring win a national title. So this is a good FCS program. He was the offensive line coach there. And he produced a couple of real solid all-conference players in Colby Thomas and Tyler Edwards, and then ends up going to Louisiana for 1 year in 2021. The Raging Cajuns rushed for 31 touchdowns and about 2,500 yards on the ground, which was good for 2nd and 3rd place in the conference, respectively. Will, seems like a great hire on the surface here. We saw Max Starks endorse him on Twitter, former Gator Max Starks, who played with the Pittsburgh Steelers, give a ringing endorsement of Stapleton on Twitter. Seems like an upgrade from what we had previously, Will.
Well, I mean, yes. And I think the resume that you put in there, one of the fears when Napier came in was that he was just going to basically bring his Louisiana staff with him. And I think there's definitely a Louisiana flavor to everybody who's come in this direction, right? But a guy like Corey Raymond bringing him in from LSU, a guy like Kerry Colbert bringing him in from USC. Yes, Jabbar Jaluk and Patrick Toney are from Louisiana, but these other guys that he's bringing in may have a Louisiana tinge to them, but they're not just guys who were with him at Louisiana. And I think, some of the rumored guys who may be coming in, who all have NFL ties, right? All of those guys who the Athletic detailed, Rob Sale, Eric Henderson, Carl Scott, and Chris Rumpf coming from the Giants, Rams, Vikings, and Bears. Again, some of those guys have worked with Napier in the past. But it's not just hey, everybody who worked with me at Mississippi State is going to come work with me at Florida. It's these guys worked with me at either Alabama or Louisiana or some other stop along the way, went and succeeded someplace else, and now I'm bringing them back to my staff here at Florida. And I think that's the difference that you're starting to see with some of these guys who are coming in.
Another coach that was announced recently, Kerry Colbert, wide receiver. For those of us who are old enough, remember him as a great receiver for the USC Trojans back in the day when USC was cooking. He's played in the NFL for 6 seasons, spending time with the Panthers, Broncos, Seahawks, Lions, and Chiefs from 2004 to 2011. Finished his pro career with 130 receptions for 1,600 yards and 8 touchdowns. Colbert cross paths with Napier as an Alabama offensive analyst from 2014 to 2015. They were both at Alabama together. Colbert then left for the same position at Southern Cal in 2016, eventually, and he ended up staying on the staff through this past season when Clay Helton was fired. He earned a promotion to tight ends coach after 2018 and has been a receivers coach from 2019. Southern Cal has been down in recent years, but their receiving core has actually been pretty solid. Drake London had a great season out there. You've seen Michael Pittman. Drake London, by the way, projected first-round pick for the NFL. Michael Pittman Jr., big deal out there. So he's developed a few good, solid receivers through that USC program, and Colbert should inject some life into that wide receiver room here at Florida. He's going to need some help heading into 2022 because that's going to be a position where the Gators are looking a little bit lean here.
Yeah, we talked about recruiting identity earlier. That's the only thing that has me scratch my head on this one a little bit. Is Colbert maybe the most gifted from a coaching perspective, but does he have the connections to draw that circle around Florida and bring people in? Certainly he has the pedigree to be able to do that. And so the question will be, can he? There have been a lot of offers going out to guys on the West Coast here recently, and that's something that I'm looking at, I guess, from a transition class perspective. You got to get the talent where it's available at this point, and Colbert already has relationships with guys out on the West Coast, and so it makes some sense. The thing I would look at when it comes to Colbert is Florida still offering guys significantly and spending a bunch of time on the West Coast with guys next year, because I think that's probably, like I said, Bill called it chasing pyrite. I think that's accurate, right? You hope that what you see then is a transition from being in California focused to being Florida focused when you go from the transition class to the bump class.
Yeah, and of course, Napier was wide receivers coach himself at Alabama, came down to Florida, landed, I believe, Calvin Ridley and who else out of Fort Lauderdale there, Will? Another big receiver for Bama.
Yeah, I know you're talking about, but Judy?
Yeah, Judy. Yeah. So Napier himself has recruited big-time receivers out of Florida. So maybe that receiver spot is a position where he's a little bit okay taking a risk like that. That could play into it. Tight end coach was announced as well. William Peagler. Peagler arrives after spending the past 2 seasons at Michigan State as a running backs coach. Napier has ties to Peagler dating back to the Clemson, and Peagler began his career at Clemson, where he was a student assistant for the Tigers from 2006 to 2009. Napier later hired him at Louisiana in 2018, where he spent a season before he went to Colorado in 2019. That's, of course, where he connected with Mel Tucker. He did have a year in between there, I believe, where he spent at Georgia, helped as a GA at Georgia. It's where he met Tucker before going to Colorado too. Big time get here in the sense that young and upcoming coach, but he had a great year this past season with transfer Kenneth Walker III, who was a Heisman candidate by midseason. Shut down after a bad game against Ohio State. You didn't hear much about Walker after that. But for most of the season, Walker, who ended up putting up 1,600 yards, 18 touchdowns this season, was in that mix for the Heisman Trophy. And he's going to be one of the top backs taken in the 22 NFL draft. Also notable during his time at Michigan State, Peagler played a big part in the commitment of consensus 4-star defensive lineman Alex Van Sermeren and athlete Dylan Tatum, and as well as several other prospects. So this is a guy who's been through that system with Mel Tucker, which is a lot like Nick Saban. He's worked with Napier in the past. There's a level of comfort there with him. And he's only, I believe, 36 years old. So a young and up incumbent coach on this staff at the tight end spot, Will.
Well, you can really say that about all these coaches, right? I mean, Darnell Stapleton, I think, is only 36. You got Colbert, who I think is 39. You've got Patrick Toney, who's 32. You've got Peagler now, who's 32 as well. Out of the rumored guys, Rob Sale, Eric Henderson, and Carl Scott are all pretty young. Chris Rumpf is 50, so he's a little bit older. So is Corey Raymond. But, Napier's not that old either. He's 41, 42 years old. And so from the standpoint of the difference between Dan Mullen being sort of mid to late 40s, and then you've got guys like Gonzalez, and you've got guys like Brewster, and you've got guys like Havasi, and those guys, look at the Florida staff. Like those guys are all 50, right? Like just about everybody's sitting in that range. And the story that came out, I think it was Goal Camp at 24/7, but if I'm wrong, I apologize. But talking about Patrick Toney playing PlayStation with Shamar James the night before early signing day, and you sit there going, can you imagine Grantham playing PlayStation with somebody the night before signing day? Like it's not happening, right? And it's just there's a different generation, and we see this all the time, right? Is that you get to a place where Bill Snyder was a great coach at Kansas State, but by the time he was like 75 and they brought him back for the second stint there at Kansas State, like the generation gap between him and the 18-year-olds he was trying to bring in was really significant. And a place like Kansas State, I mean, the desire to win and the level of recruit is a little bit different there. But you even saw it with Bob Stoops, where when he came in at Oklahoma, he recruited top 5, top 7, pretty much over and over and over again, was able to win a national championship and won the Big 12 straight. And then before Lincoln Riley took over, 5 or 6 years before Lincoln Riley took over, you started to see the recruiting sort of tail off for Stoops, and Oklahoma started to not be the dominant force that it had been for about a decade under Stoops. And Lincoln Riley comes in, and immediately Oklahoma's recruiting at the exact same level that they were when Stoops came in originally. So I think getting fresh blood in, getting guys who can relate, but guys who are old enough and have experience to be able to relay that experience onto the players is important. And that's a delicate balance, right? Because guys like Dan Mullen, guys like Todd Grantham, maybe have things they can transmit to players that's important from their experience. At the same time, if you can't relate to a player, so you can't get that message across, it doesn't matter if you have a ton of knowledge if that knowledge doesn't get transmitted from you to the player when he's on the field. And I think having younger guys gives Florida the opportunity to do that, and then having a couple of older guys to sort of steward things along the way is important as well. So guys like Raymond, guys like Rumpf, having the ability to do that, I think will be important from the standpoint of when things go bad, when things start to go wonky, you do need somebody who's been through those wars before. If everybody's 32, that might be a problem, right? But these guys, there are some guys who've been through those wars and are going to be able to sort of steady the ship. But the young guys who are hungry and are willing to go out there and build those relationships and hit the recruiting trail hard, because these guys all are looking for their first shot at an advancement or a head coaching job, right? You look at a guy like Patrick Toney, that's his next step, right? If Florida's successful, if this defense turns around 2 years from now, he's getting hired somewhere else, either in the SEC, the ACC, or the Big Ten, probably to then lead a program with significant juice. Same thing if you think about a guy like Corey Raymond. He's cornerbacks coach now, but could he be a defensive coordinator someplace? And is that what he wants to do? These guys all have the opportunity to take steps up, especially on the defensive side of the ball, because of what Florida has been thus far. And I think that's an attractive thing for people, and it's going to keep them hungry as they're trying to build.
We've seen in the last 24 hours, it's been announced that Tosh Lapoy from the Jacksonville Jaguars is expected to join Oregon. Dan Lanning at Oregon as defensive coordinator. I know you mentioned Rumpf and a couple other names there, Will. When do you expect this staff to be fully complete?
The minute these guys are out of the playoffs. So, the NFL season for the Giants is going to end in a couple of weeks. And so, Rob Sale has been linked, and obviously he spent some time at Louisiana. And, I'm not breaking news here. I mean, this is on the Athletic site right now. I'm going down. They've got projected salaries for these guys. And Sale, Eric Henderson for the Rams, and Carl Scott for the Vikings are all at $1 million. And then Chris Rumpf, they've got listed at $850,000. So the Bears, the Vikings, and the Giants, it'll be 2 weeks. And then the Rams will be whenever they get bounced from the playoffs, right? And Henderson will be the defensive line coach, will be the guy who comes in after that. So I suspect that these things are already in place if the Athletic was reporting it. Maybe there's some changes along the way. I mean, obviously there were some early reports that Lupoy might end up at Florida as well. Some complications with the SEC there is some of the stuff that you hear, but also, look, I mean, Lanning and him have a good relationship, and Oregon might be a place for him to get advancement that he wouldn't be able to get with all the NFL guys on the staff here at Florida. So, it's interesting. It's funny when Mullen brought all of his guys from Mississippi State, that was a reasonable thing to me at the time. And I think we saw the warts along the way, but the expectation is that being at Florida was going to offset some of the warts that you might have, right? The Havase's a little bit rough around the edges, but at the end of the day, elite offensive line recruits are going to want to come play in an elite offense because Dan Mullen has a reputation for being an elite offensive guy. At the end of the day, I think, and you can see this with Saban, like, the assistants just shuffle in and out at Alabama at this point, right? And the recruiting apparatus stays the same. And so that's, I think, what you need to look for Billy Napier. Like, the staff hires are important because he's got to find people who buy into his system that he trusts, who can help build relationships and all that sort of stuff. But at the end of the day, guys like Kamari Wilson are coming to Florida because of Billy Napier. They're not coming because of Patrick Toney. They're not coming because of Corey Raymond. They're not coming because of Kerry Colbert. I mean, they may come because they like those guys and have a relationship with them and all that sort of stuff. But they know as well as we do. I mean, Patrick Toney, if Florida's defense turns around the next 2 years and is all of a sudden an elite unit, Tony's getting a job someplace, right? And so, you've got to come for Napier. In fact, you want Toney to get a job someplace, because if you're Kamari Wilson, that means you're a top 10 draft pick. You know what I mean? So,
if we're operating at the level we're capable of, and we're losing coaches to other places through promotions, that's a great problem to have. So
absolutely,
let's hope we see that over the next few years. I mean, the only place you haven't seen that is over the last, pretty much whenever a staff is successful, they're always rated outside of what's been going on at Clemson over the last decade. And we saw what happened this past offseason with that staff. So it'll happen. If it doesn't happen at one point, it will happen eventually if you have enough success. And so getting guys hired away will be a good thing. So hopefully the staff itself, while exciting, should not be the total defining element of the program either. It's that guy at the top. It's the Saban machine at Alabama. It's Kirby Smart's machine at Georgia. Dabo, we'll see what he does with all these changes here at Clemson. But first time he's going to see that challenge, and hopefully Napier gets to go through that at some point as well.
Yeah, it's just like everything else, right? You don't want to overreact to one recruit. The only one I might make an exception for is, like I said, Wilson for IMG feels like more than one recruit. But, you've got guys like Shamar James and Chris McClellan who decided to come to Florida, and that's a big deal. And chaining those guys together is a big deal. But at the end of the day, if McClellan had decided to go someplace else, or if Devin Moore had decided to go someplace else, that wouldn't be like this black stain on Billy Napier. Him coming is obviously a notch in his belt, but it's not like a black stain. I think it's the same thing with the coach, right? Like, I would have been excited about Tosh Lupoy being on the staff. I think at the end of the day, that guy's proven to be a really good recruiter and has Alabama ties and knows the Saban system and all that sort of stuff. He decided to go someplace else. Is that the end of the world? No, it's not. I think that you can get somebody who's just as good, maybe even better, to be honest, if you go out and find guys from the NFL. But you might also find someone who's worse. And that's the reality, is that, at the end of the day, you're going to hit some, you're going to miss some. You got to hit more than you miss, and you got to bring in people who fit what you're trying to do. And so hopefully these guys that Napier's bringing in fit what he wants to do, and he can keep them around for 2 or 3 years to make sure that they build the thing in place. Because that is one thing I will say about Saban, is Kirby Smart was there with him for a long time, waiting for the perfect job. And then when the Georgia job came open, one, Smart was ready for it mostly, but two, when he jumped, Saban had multiple years of Smart being his defensive coordinator for that entire time. I think one of the things you've seen with some of Saban's disciples who've left early have been that they've struggled in many cases because the I'm a Nick Saban assistant really isn't enough to just get people to come and to build the program. There is an entire the game jumps considerably when you go from being coordinator, where Saban has the apparatus taking care of everything, to where you have to be the person to put the apparatus in place. And the hope is that's what Napier learned in his time at Louisiana. Is it's a big difference between being an offensive coordinator at Clemson or an analyst at Alabama, or even being an offensive coordinator someplace else, and being the head guy where you have to put the apparatus in place. And so as long as he can get that apparatus in place and free up these guys to do what they've been trained to do, I think everything will be fine.
Well, it seems like Napier's army is coming together, and we'll keep seeing those announcements roll out here week by week here on Gator social media. Hey, everybody, this will be the last episode of the year for Stand Up and Holler. We'll be back next week, of course. But just want to wish everybody a happy new year. Please continue to follow along and subscribe to our content. If you have any friends that are Gator fans, please pass this along. We're continuing to try to grow this. We've received tremendous support throughout the season, and we've grown throughout the season. And I just want to say thank you to everybody out there. This is a blast to do, and we hope to continue to grow this thing in 2022. Happy New Year to everyone. I'll leave the final words here for Will Miles.
Man, just, again, like you said, Happy New Year to everybody. Appreciate all your support. This is fun to do. And certainly, go check out some bonus episodes over at Patreon if you need something to hold you over, or if you just want to support us over there. But really, we appreciate everybody. Make sure you like and subscribe. That helps us out. Most of you have done that, so we appreciate that. But, hey, better days ahead. That's one of the things that's exciting. And so, looking forward to this 2022 year, getting to analyze somebody new and doing it with all you guys who've been with us from the beginning.
That's a wrap on the Dan Mullen era. On to the Billy Napier era. Happy New Year and go Gators. Thank you for watching this episode of Stand Up and Holler. Be sure to subscribe to the Read and Reaction YouTube channel. Join our Patreon community at Read and Reaction for bonus content each week. And check out our website at readandreaction.com. I'm Nick Knudsen, joined by Will Miles, and as always, go Gators.